Hi, and welcome to Objective 3. Objective 3 is going to take Objective 2 and I think make a little more sense out of it. So essentially what I'm going to do is show you our destination, and then we're going to talk about each graph individually, put it back together again. So let me go ahead and share my screen with you, because sometimes I think this can be very confusing until we get to this objective. Whoops, it would help if I start my slideshow. Okay, so we're going to take a look at how the quantity of loanable funds, or the loanable funds market, is related to net capital outflow, which is related to the real exchange rate. What's driving this on the front end is essentially the real rate of interest. So the real rate of interest drives the quantity of loanable funds, which drives net capital outflow, which drives the exchange rate. And it can go backwards as well. So I probably should put some arrows this way. Okay, so that's essentially what we're looking at in this graph. Remember that the higher the interest rate or real rate of interest, then the more people are going to want to save. The lower the real interest rate, then the more people are going to want to borrow. Okay, that's the domestic side. Remember that we will save wherever our saving rate is highest. So that could be domestically or abroad. We're going to borrow where the interest rate is lower. So that could be domestically or abroad as well. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at where we're going to end up. So let's look at panel A right here. We have the real interest rate. Remember, that's the real rate of interest, no inflation here. We have the supply of loanable funds. Recall that that is private and public savings. We have the demand for loanable funds, which is made up of domestic investment plus net capital outflow. You could think of net capital outflow maybe as foreign money coming into the U.S. Now, here we have the interest rate. That's the balancer between these two, where the quantity of loanable funds and the supply, the demand for loanable funds and the supply of loanable funds equal each other, will be the quantity of loanable funds that we have domestically. So that's previous. We've looked at that in other chapters. Now, essentially what we do is propel this. Again, I said the driver, right? So now we have the second panel. Here's the real interest rate. Okay, notice it's the same as an A. We then bring that to net capital outflow. Net capital outflow is negatively sloped. Why would that be? Okay, why would it be negatively sloped? Because remember that we're going to want to save with the higher interest rate. So the higher the real rate of interest, the more that capital is going to flow. And the lower the real interest rate, then the capital is going to flow to other countries. So the higher the interest rate, the more capital will stay domestically. The lower the interest rate, the more capital will flow. We're going to talk about that again in a moment. We then follow that down into a third graph, right? So here we have the supply, or the quantity of dollars, and this is the market for foreign currency exchange. Because our money supply is fixed, but the supply of foreign currency exchange, dollars in the foreign market, dollars in foreign market, so that is perfectly inelastic because it's fixed at one point in time. And then we have the demand. This is going to be the demand right here. Demand for foreign currency. Again, where does that demand really derive from? It derives from net exports, where those two crisscross will become our real exchange rate. So let's pick this apart, take it a little slower, and make sure you understand each panel. Okay, so our first panel, this very first one, A, the market for loanable funds. So we're going to draw the market for loanable funds and see if you can kind of like jump ahead of me here. Over here, we have the real rate of interest. Okay, down here, we have the quantity of loanable funds. We have a demand curve downward sloping. That is domestic investment plus net capital outflow. We then have the supply curve, which is made up of national savings. Okay, where the supply curve? National savings meets investment. That's going to be our real exchange rate, so R here. This will be the quantity of loanable funds in the domestic market. So far, so good. So that was panel A. Now, we then propel that into panel B, which is what we're going to do next. Okay. Okay, so this is panel B. And remember, panel B, we have that real interest rate from panel A. We bring it over. And it's going to hit right here. This will be net capital outflow. Now, why? Because if you think about it this way, if the real interest rate is very high, right? So it's somewhere up here, then people are going to want to keep their dollars here at home because the US is paying a high interest rate. So what that essentially means is dollars stay home and net capital outflow is negative, which we know then net exports is negative. We're running a trade deficit. On the opposite side, let's say we had a low interest rate, something down here. Then what would happen is dollars would flow abroad to higher paying interests, leave US. And when dollars leave the US, net capital outflow is positive, and we know then net exports would be greater than zero, or we're running a trade surplus. So this is panel B. Okay, so again, just kind of reiterating, so that net capital outflow slopes downward, and the real equilibrium interest rate is the tying force between panel A, the quantity of the market for loanable funds, and B, which is net capital outflow. So A, panel B. Panel C is the market for foreign exchange. So now we take from panel B, we had net capital outflow here. Okay, we have the real interest rate coming in. And now what we do is essentially bring this down. And this is our supply. And our supply, as you can see right here, is going to be net capital outflow. Okay, our demand in this graph, in our third panel, is going to be net exports. We're tying those two together. Where the two crisscross, that intersection is going to be the equilibrium exchange rate. So the price of goods and services in the present relative to the price in the future. Okay, so the equilibrium real exchange rate is the price of domestic goods and services relative to foreign goods and services. This is panel C, right, that we just looked at. Now, one of the things to note is that both the real exchange rate and the real interest rate adjust simultaneously. So this is why I can say, and I'm just going to redraw this because I think it's worth going over a couple times. So we have the quantity of loanable funds. We have the demand for loanable funds, which is investment plus net capital outflow. Then we have the supply of loanable funds, which is national savings, okay? Where the two intersect, that is our real interest rate, We're going to follow it down. This is the quantity of loanable funds. We then follow that into the second panel. Okay, and this is net capital outflow. And this is our real interest rate. And we're going to have net capital outflow here. So we're right about there. We then follow that down and make another panel. And we're going to make that net capital outflow right here. And that's our supply. We then have the demand, which is net exports, where those two crisscross will be the real exchange rate. Now, as I said previously, we could have a change or a shift in any of these. Now, normally what we'll see is we'll see a change in panel A. What if something happens that increases investment domestically? What if something happens that the budget deficit, for example, which changes national savings? So those are some factors that can change over here. We then also would have, what about exchange? What about prices, both domestically and abroad? So that could change net exports. And we also have the real exchange rate. So when we talk about adjusting simultaneously, what we mean are there's some variables that could easily change that would make a big difference here. Okay, and those would be the following that you see. So I talked about savings already. I talked about investment already. The one I didn't talk about was net capital outflow, because remember that we go where the interest rate is highest. So the net capital outflow might be a factor that other countries are paying a higher interest rate. So therefore that affects net capital outflow, right? So that in that respect, dollars would leave the US. And again, net exports, trade deals, things like that. So all of these can be adjusted backward and forward. We're going to look at a few examples of that. Okay, so now hopefully you can look at this, read through it, and understand what each panel means. And just remember that net capital outflow is really the link between the quantity of loanable funds domestically and the market for foreign currency exchange, or the real exchange rate. Okay, hopefully that helped clear up any confusion you might have between Objective 2 and Objective 3. In the next objectives 4 and 5, we're going to look at how changes, for example, national savings changes that we've already looked at, what happens domestically. But now we're going to see what happens to the exchange rate as a result, what happens to net capital outflow as a result. And then in our last objective, we'll talk about capital flight. And that is where dollars leave a country or dollars are flowing into a country. Actually, that's capital inboarding. It's a little different. So I'll see you back in the next objective. Thanks.